symposium that you are attending is called 35 Years After Larry P. Implications for School Psychology. Now, before we get started, just to get a sense of the room, how many people here are or work in California? If I can get a raise, it looks like the majority of you. Okay, wonderful. California has the singular distinction of being the largest and the nation's most populous state with close to 35 million residents. Another way to say this is that 1 out of every 8 Americans lives in California. California joins Texas, Hawaii, and New Mexico as one of only 4 majority-minority states in America. California also has the distinction of being the setting for a famous court case that has had significant implications for the practice of school psychology. Larry P. versus Riles was a class action lawsuit which essentially argued that black children in the state of California had been misplaced into educable mentally retarded, or EMR classes, because of racial bias of the intelligence tests that they took. By the way, EMR classes were completely dismissed in the state by the mid-1980s. Wilson Riles was the superintendent of public instruction for the state of California. So the term Larry P. is the name given to one of 5 black children who served as plaintiffs in the case. The Larry P. trial itself occurred over 65 days between October 1977 to May 1978. More than 50 expert witnesses in psychometrics, school psychology, sociology, education, and clinical psychology testified for both the plaintiffs and the defendants. The transcript of the trial proceedings took up over 10,000 pages. Judge Robert Peckham, who resided over the trial, handed down his decision in 1979, which declared that intelligence tests should not be used to qualify African American students for EMR classes or their substantial equivalent. In 1986, the court expanded the injunction to ban the use of intelligence tests for black children for any special education purpose. In addition, IQ tests may not be given to a black pupil even with parental consent. If a school district receives records containing test protocols from other agencies, the IQ scores contained in the record shall not become a part of the pupil's current school record. There were a series of legal twists and turns that occurred after this expanded injunction that I will not go into here, but which are discussed in the green handout there on the back table there. So if you haven't picked that up when you came in, make sure you pick that up. The bottom line is that in 1992, the Special Education Branch of the California Department of Education issued a legal advisory to the state declaring that the IQ test ban for African Americans should continue in California despite successful legal challenges to this ban. Currently, the California State Department of Education ban has lasted to this day. It has been 35 years since that decision, and we don't have to speculate about the future because we have lived through it. Our purpose here this morning is not to relitigate this case or to complain over what went wrong. What is done, and California has had over 2 decades of having to live under this ruling. The purpose of this symposium is to provide an honest assessment of how things have worked out and where we need to go from here. I am pleased to play a small role in putting together this outstanding panel who will address you on this important topic this morning. As I was putting this introduction together, I first wanted to say that these folks represent the top persons in California school psychology. This, however, would not do them justice. It is more accurate to describe them as being among the best and the brightest trainers, practitioners, and consultants today in school psychology, period, all of whom just happen to live in California. So without further ado, let me introduce this outstanding panel, and I'll do so alphabetically. I'll start with Dr. Brandon Gamble. Can you just raise your hand, Brandon? Dr. Gamble currently serves as Associate Professor in the School Psychology Program at California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Gamble has also served as past president of the California Association of School Psychologists from 2012 to 2013. Before that, he served as the Cultural, Linguistic, and Diversity Chair for CASP for 5 years. Dr. Gamble has been a member of the Association of Black Psychologists, the National Association of School Psychologists, and the California Association of School Psychologists for over 20 years. Currently, Dr. Gamble serves as the appointed liaison between the Association of Black Psychologists and CASP and NASP. He has written articles for the CASP Today newsletter on the overrepresentation of African American students in California special education. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Betty Henry. Raise your hand. Dr. Henry currently serves as school psychologist for the California School for the Blind, a position she has held since 2006. Between 1980 and 1986, Dr. Henry served as instructor and coordinator for the APA accredited school psychology program at the University of California, Berkeley. Between 1992 and 1993, Dr. Henry served as the California Association of School Psychologists president as she guided the association in responding to the California State Department legal advisory banning IQ tests, as well as coordinating CASP's legal challenge to the State Department advisory. Dr. Henry is also co-author of a recently published article in Contemporary School Psychology on the Larry P. case and its implications for school psychology. Next person I'd like to introduce is Dr. James Hiramoto. Dr. James Hiramoto currently serves as a school psychologist for the Diagnostic Center of Northern California, which is housed within the State Special Schools and Services Division of the California Department of Education. For the past 6 years in this capacity, Dr. Hiramoto provides statewide professional development trainings and conducts evaluations on some of California's most difficult to serve special education students. Dr. Hiramoto is also the co-author of the Diagnostic Center's Best Practices Guidelines for the Alternative Assessment of African American Cognitive Processes. He has led SELPA and school district projects in the state to help reduce special education disproportionality. Dr. Hiramoto also currently serves as the Regional 2 representative for the California Association of School Psychologists, where he is an active member of the Legislative, Cultural, and Linguistic Diversity Committee. Next is Ruben Lopez. Ruben, raise your hand. Mr. Lopez has served as a school psychologist for Moreno Valley Unified School District in California from 1990 to the present. In the late 80s to the early 2000s, Mr. Lopez was a member of the Larry P. Task Force for the California Department of Education and contributor to the Larry P. Task Force report of January 1989. During this time, he represented CASP on various California Department of Education committees related to Larry P., helping to develop specific assessment practices for the entire state and to develop procedures to evaluate California school districts and practices for assessing African American students under Larry P. Mr. Lopez has made several invited presentations to the California Board of Education on developing procedures for evaluating specific tests for assessing African American students in light of the Larry P. decision. In addition to writing on specific assessment practices, Mr. Lopez has written various articles appearing in the CASP newsletter, CASP Today, related to how to understand and resolve disproportionate representation of African American students in special education. Next is Mr. Roger McCoy. Mr. Roger McCoy currently serves as school psychologist and program specialist with the Riverside County Special Education Local Plan Area. He also serves as the current president of the Riverside Association of School Psychologists. Before this, he has served as secretary-treasurer with the CASP. When the California Department of Education imposed certain mandates in the Riverside School District as to what assessments they were not permitted to administer to black students, Mr. McCoy has played an important role in helping his special education region rewrite their policies and procedures, as well as immersing himself in the legal history of Larry P. and other related cases in California. And finally, we have Dr. Frank Worrell. Dr. Frank Worrell is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he serves as director of the APA-accredited school psychology program there. He is also a licensed psychologist and certified school psychologist. Dr. Worrell's area of expertise include academic talent development, at-risk youth, and sociocultural factors related to educational and psychological functioning. He is a fellow in 5 divisions of the American Psychological Association, a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, an elected member of the Society for the Study of School Psychology, and he is editor of the Review of Educational Research through 2016. Dr. Worrell has also served as past president of the School Psychology Division of APA Division 16. Dr. Worrell recently completed his 2nd term as one of the Division 16 representatives on the APA Council and is currently a member of the APA Board of Directors. In 2015, he received the Distinguished Contributions to Research Award from Division 45 of APA, the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our panel. At this juncture, I'd like to give each panel member approximately 5 minutes to address this group on their thoughts related to this topic and their role in it. And I'll just go in alphabetical order, starting with Dr. Gamble.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
As I tend to do, I like to remember things to give context to what's happening. So the big thought that I had is from Louisiana to the Bay. You know, most black folk who live in California came from either Texas, where my family is from, or Louisiana. So as I sit here, I think about, you know, optimism and hope as they moved from Louisiana. You're thinking about after World War II, the 40s and the 50s, and they come to California trying to maintain a sense of dignity. Right? So I wonder what Larry P. is doing now. He and the other children would be about my age, plus or minus 5 years. And I wonder about their families as well. So, as I mentioned, my family's from East Texas. They came to LA. I had an uncle named Johnny. He was a union organizer. Folks came after him during the 20s, and he kept running until he ran out of land, basically, and settled in California. Then the rest of my family, over the years, came to California. I'm also thinking about Francis Cecil Sumner. He was the first black person to earn a PhD in psychology. And not by coincidence, I think. We've been looking at these issues for at least over 100 years. He studied IQ testing. So I try to keep a bit of that spirit with me. I also learned recently that he pledged the same fraternity I'm a part of. So,
It's good.
and I have a few fraternity brothers here today.
Yeah.
All right. So we've been wrestling with that question for a century. I think of also Mamie and Kenneth Clark, Reginald Jones, who are also folks who helped wrestle with that. All right. And you got to turn it on. There we go.
Yeah.
All right. And I'm losing my voice. So thank you. Asa Hilliard, who taught me about looking for excellence in assessments and also context for Black lives. Robert Guthrie, who continued to issue a challenge. Every time I went to the Association of Black Psychologists convention, he said, you know, we got started working on this whole Larry P thing, and then we just kind of let it kind of sit for a little while. And he was always offering challenges. And I had a chance to sit next to him when I was an undergrad and a graduate student and just hear him and his fire. Frances Quest Welsing, she taught me how to fight and stay calm. And be able to say some wild things, but still keep a smile. Valerie Cook Morales, who at San Diego State, who she passed away in, it seems like yesterday, but she really inspired me to go on and pursue this particular area. And I had no idea about school psychology and all those other things, but I read something that she had wrote, and that was a requirement to get into San Diego State, that you had to read about overrepresentation. I said, what is going on around here? I was just fired up. So I had to go there. I want to thank my wife, who just came in. She came all the way to New Orleans with me. We got to be together on Valentine's Day, so that's how it goes. I appreciate Dr. Frisby and the rest of the crew for the invite. This topic feels, you know, like the Greek story of Sisyphus, who's, you know, pushing that rock up a hill and it keeps rolling back down. And you do it every day. I've been looking at it for at least 20 years and definitely longer for folks. So I'm hoping that we can get some momentum. There's some exciting times. So I'll say this last piece. We'll wear two hats today. One is as the CAST president, and I'll do that briefly, but I've also been a member of the Association of Black Psychologists for 21 years. So that's how I'll speak most of the time. And I'll let you know very particularly when I'm putting on my CAST hat.
I want to stand up there so I can use the thing. Do I need this? Or?
Yeah, I need that.
Okay, I can figure this out. First thing is I'm shorter than whoever was here before. I'm going to stand there. Oh, you're seeing my provocative slide. Okay. If I put this down, can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. So, Craig very nicely said that, you know, we're not here to revisit why. We're here to talk about what to go forward. But I feel like an overview of why is really essential here. So, first thing, because I work with blind people, I'd like to use the analogy of 5 blind men who are describing an elephant. And one describes the, I'm going to hold this. One describes the trunk, one describes the legs, one describes the tail, one describes the body, and one describes the ears, and you'd never guess that it was a single animal. And I feel like Larry P., which is the elephant in the room in California, in my mind, also has this same thing where some people look at it as a history of oppression, some people look at it as bad tests, some people look at it in a wide variety of range, bad programs, bad luck. I look at it very strongly as something that's taken us away from looking at cognition and has taken us to looking at children with simplistic views and ignoring what created the problem in the first place. But I think it's important to mention 35 years later, we still have disproportion. We haven't fixed the problem. We just killed the tests. To put the context, in 1970, it wasn't school psychologists. It was the San Francisco Unified working with Larry P. was a 12-year-old student. It was school psychometrists who were people who were instructed. They were a little bit more elevated than school secretaries. They were given some classwork on how to teach, how to give tests. They were assigned by administrators to fill classrooms that would take disruptive and difficult children out of the classrooms and into special programs, which unfortunately were not better and unique, individualized support for their needs. They were assigned to give IQ tests, not to interpret them, to create a score, send the scores to administrators who sent parents assignments to classrooms. There was no parent conference. There was no discussion of the results. This is what got us here. I also like to use the analogy of a hammer. IQ tests are like a hammer. A hammer is something that can build a house or it can crack a skull. IQ tests were used more like to crack a skull. They weren't really supportive or helpful. In some cases, they were applied inappropriately with very negative conclusions. This is what's happened as a result of Larry P. This is my provocative slide. I seem to have a trigger finger. Just put these over here. Okay, this ruling of school psychology with Larry P. allowed school psychologists to take the blame for education failures. Dr. Gamble referred to the inspiration he received from Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Hilliard also used the phrase that school psychologists were the gatekeepers to segregation. School psychologists were allowed to take the blame for issues of disproportionate placement and with dead-end programs. Three hands would be helpful. I had the opportunity to, my position is I'm on the outreach committee for team for schools, the California School for the Blind. So I travel around the state to do assessments for children who are not doing well. No one comes to our attention if they're successful. Usually there's lawyers involved. And there was a University of California professor who had a child who was with a significant visual impairment, and she was a professor of African American studies and was African American with a Yale degree. And she was saying she wanted an IQ test for her child, not because she wanted a score, but because she really wanted to know how her child learned and how her child compared despite the disadvantages of not having vision. 1 minute, huh? Okay. Okay, and so her question was, I question the intelligence that has gone into an intelligence test that can't be colorblind. This is true in California, but I want it to be noted very clearly that the WIPSI 4 boldly reimagined shows a child. I question the intelligence that has gone into an intelligence test that can't be colorblind. This is true in California, but I want it to be noted very clearly that the WIPSI 4 boldly reimagined shows a child who is not white. The rest of the country has moved on. They still use cognition as an important aspect of considering. This is what I consider the most important slide here. That if you tell someone, there is such a thing as stereotype threat, that if you tell someone that you're going to give this child a test and there's going to be a score and that's going to determine whether or not he is worthy of an education, you are doing something very wrong. But what we've done is we've moved away from the idea of treating cognition as an important part of learning. We've also done something which unfortunately in many schools that are urban, inner city, minority, majority, we have curriculum that is highly rote, that is just, you can memorize your way to success. And these tests can sometimes leave you that impression. They ignore what I consider, again, the elephant in the room, the fact that even in the original case, when you took families in which they had interaction, intimate family interaction involved discussion, games, vocabulary development through conversation, the differences in IQ scores evaporated. It was stronger than race, it was stronger than income, it was stronger than all other variables. That was the variable that differentiated. And instead of working to develop programs that really tell parents, work with your child, spend time, schools do the same, we've moved away from that and put it on the test. But cognition is really important and we need descriptions of it. And so this is my horror slide. I think I see thousands of school psychology reports. In a significant section of California, they use this boilerplate language. which says that if you have 2 scores at an average level in an academic area, could be spelling, could be rote math, could be handwriting, you are considered to have average intelligence. This is on the reports. If you have 2 scores in adaptive behavior, and this is an or, not an and, you are considered to have average intelligence. Most adaptive behavior is by teacher or parent opinion. I've seen reports in which a parent says, my child's average cognition, he can make toast. The kid is 10. It is not always accurate. You're making assumptions of average, not average value as a human being, but you're just failing to describe cognition. And so finally, I think what we've done is we've found something that is wrong, and I'm going to use my final line, and then I'm off of here. Okay. School psychologists who work with African American students in California work under a mandate that is clear, simple, and wrong. It's don't use IQ test. And every time a psychologist makes a practice decision that doesn't reflect the best choice for the welfare of the individual client, there's a loss to the individual and to the profession.
Hello. Just to be clear, I am a California Department of Education employee. I do not represent the California Department of Education. just to be clear. We can't change the past. Larry P. happened, and we're under a current rule governing that by the California Department of Education. My concern is if the purpose of this is to just allow school psychologists to suddenly give IQ tests to African Americans, I have a problem with that, if that's the only thing we're doing. California has allowed school psychologists not to require continuing education. That is a concern for me, because there are many practitioners that haven't had continuing education in California for several years, going on, I think, since the mid-90s, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of things have happened since the mid-90s. Our understanding of culture has shifted quite a bit. Understanding of stereotype threat has changed quite a bit. Our understanding of the structure of cognitive ability has shifted to a point where tests are being developed to predict more of the broad score factors than the overall factor. Well, in California, and you may not know this, but the prevailing way of identifying a specific learning disability is the discrepancy model. Well, if the overall ability is only accounting for 25% of the variance, 75% of the reason why you're putting that kid in special ed isn't. That is my concern. If all we're doing is saying, okay, go ahead and give the test, I have a problem. That's enough for me.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today. I very much appreciate it. May I first recommend that you do a Google search of Larry P.B. Ryle's court decision of October 16, 1979 in the Federal Register. One, because it is important to consider what U.S. Federal Court Judge Robert Peckham actually said. Number two, because you will read the story of how the state of California, in its legal defense, did such a self-defeating job in defending the use of intelligence, what we generally now call cognitive tests in schools. Number three, because I think you'll be surprised, if not shocked, by some of the things Judge Peckham actually says, despite some of the interpretations of what he said you may hear today here in New Orleans, or from organizations like CASHA, the California Speech Language Hearing Association on Larry P. But I must warn you that by reading the decision you will learn or be reminded that legal writing is some pretty bad writing. Very often asking yourself, where are the subjects and verb in Peckham's much too long sentences? On the other hand, you will find Peckham's writing about intelligence tests and their effects on black children in San Francisco Unified School District not bland, but rhetorically very impressive. And for a school psychologist, very challenging and without doubt at least somewhat demoralizing. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Peckham uses red-hot, fiery adjectives, if not invectives, to describe the California Department of Education as way out of line in its treatment of needy kids, kids we very much care about. Now, very briefly, I must go into some of Peckham's fiery adjectives describing California's treatment of needy black kids, before moving on to a few of the many practical implications of Larry P. for practicing school psychologists. And for all of the kids we serve, Judge Peckham decided that California's use of standardized intelligence tests to place black children, quote, in special classes for the educable mentally retarded, fast forward to Rosa's Law 2010, now what we call intellectual disability, and had what he called, quote, discriminatory impact, and what he decided had, quote, not been validated for the purpose of essentially permanent placements of black children into educationally dead-end, isolated, and stigmatizing classes for the so-called educable mentally retarded. A sentence sounding, unfortunately, like the unending compound noun phrases in the German language. It's especially important to note that Peckham found San Francisco Unified's classes for these children to be dead-end, isolated, and stigmatizing. Frankly, the part of Peckham's decision that troubles me more than his problems with intelligence testing. In addition to saying that California's special education assessment procedure had what Peckham termed, quote, an unlawful segregative intent, end quote. He agreed with the plaintiffs that, quote, the tests allegedly result in misplacement of black children in special classes that doom, yes, doom them to stigma, inadequate education, and failure to develop the skills necessary to productive success in our society. Another sentence needing the fresh breath of brevity. From here, I will leave it to you to Google search the school demographics of California and the country to learn that Peckham was convinced of the unfairness of California's identification of educable mental retardation because back in 1978, black children were 1.5 times overrepresented in special education compared to white children, and are probably compared to white children, are probably more than 1.5 times the percentage in all of special education in the country. That was found in a 2007 school demographic study done by the feds. So regarding the demographic political question, more than 35 years after Larry P., African American students by percentage appear to be even more over-affected or not affected, may have helped or hurt in trying to improve special and general education for black children, for all children, by asking the following questions. And I'm going to have, I'm going to put in the back a handout. Sorry, I don't have a lot of copies of these questions. These are important questions for you to. It's just not about IQ testing or the bias related to that. The implications of Larry P. Here are the questions. Has Larry P. helped reduce African American representation in California, the country, in special ed? Number 2, has Larry P. helped to reduce ethnic group gaps in academic achievement? Number 3, has Larry P. helped in making self-contained special education classrooms pedagogically effective, in other words, special? Number 4, has Larry P. helped or hurt attempts to define and assess educational disabilities like specific learning disability, considering the errant trends such as RTI only, or intellectual disability, considering the concerns of capital punishment for black adult males. Number 5, has Larry P. helped prevent curriculum instruction disasters like whole language and new math in the 80s or Common Core at present? Has Larry P. helped or hurt in defining intellectual ability or multiple cognitive abilities or even academic aptitude, thereby protecting the public from now infamous inaccurate claims and false promises? Number 7, has Larry P. hurt mixed ethnicity children by unfairly requiring them to be labeled by a distant national or continental heritage or arbitrary skin color overshadowing his or her individuality? Number 8, has Larry P. been more politics than effective teaching for all children? That is, about cross-culturally effective teaching. In short, has Larry P. protected all children in the United States from being doomed? Yes, doomed by stigma, inadequate education, and failure to develop the skills necessary to productive success in our society. If he were still alive today, I wonder what Judge Peckin would answer. I make these comments in dedication to my dear son, Daniel James Lopez, who passed away this past December 14th on 2015.
I'm not used to sitting while I talk, but I'll try. I'm more of a Pentecostal preacher type that gets up and moves around a lot like more ADHD than anything. But I'll try. This is more Roger. I'm a school psychologist, and this interests me a whole lot. The state of California challenged me, and I'll tell you that's one of the worst things you can do, unless you really want to hear my answer, because I will research it, and I will find out. And that's how I got to meet Betty. I got to talk to James, Brandon a whole lot, and talk with them, research this issue. I know we're trying to move forward, but it is also important to understand the history, and so I've made my comments regarding that and where we are. The Larry P. injunction sought relief for the students in San Francisco schools in 4 ways. Retest all the students, ban the use of IQ tests for African American students when considering eligibility for EMR or a subsequent equivalent program. Hold public hearings to the superintendent of public education to determine if IQ tests are racially biased against African American students, and to make an approved list of tests to send to the court for review. 4, reduce the disproportionate placement into the EMR classes. Those are the basics as I saw them. Number 1 was accomplished. These kids were retested and placed into applicable classes. Number 2, the state came up with a banned test list and later expanded its inclusion to all disability categories throughout the state. You've heard others talk about that. The state also defined the term substantive equivalent as any program that was dead end. Ruben just talked about that. And then superintendent of schools at the time, Mr. Honig, stated that perhaps all special education programs are dead end, thus stigmatizing and labeling all students who are in a special education program. I found that totally unacceptable. I would argue that if the special education programs in California are dead end, it's because of the burdensome laws and restrictions put in place by the Department of Education and the legislature. Number 3, reducing disproportionality in the EMR classes was initially done in the San Francisco schools when the children were retested and removed from the EMR classes. That took care of that small population. However, the state expanded the ban to include the use of all categories of disability and to all students who even, and I hate to use this phrase, look black. As was stated 4 times in the meeting I attended with CDE in 2014. Over the years, the expansion of the ban on IQ testing of African American students has had the consequence of more students being placed into special education, in part because of practices mandated by the state, among others. Number 4, the state has never held public meetings to define whether any test is racially biased or not. To them, it seems all tests of IQ, mental age, or ability are inherently biased against one group of people. When I brought up the point with CDE that everything we do as people relates to intelligence, therefore no tests, even state-mandated testing, should be administered to African American students, all I got back as an answer was a blank stare. They had no idea what I was talking about. Opening up this bottle requires intelligence. We can do that, so we report that. But they're like, what? In the 1990s, then Superintendent Honig also said it costs over $2,000 to administer an IQ test. And Brandon says, I need to charge more for my assessments.
I know, right? I know.
And that the parents should be taking on the cost, not the schools. If they want an IQ test for their children. As it currently stands, the only parents who must pay for an intelligence test for their child are parents of black students, and in the words of CDE, they use this term 4 times, those who even look black. And my mouth hit the floor every time, and I wrote it down as a note every time that they said it, so I remembered exactly what they said. The CDE representative also told us at our meeting in Paris that the CDEs asked the Bay Area Association of Black Psychologists whether they would revisit the Larry P. issue, and they were told absolutely not. I have since learned that this was not true. The Bay Area Association was not asked about Larry P. and whether they would revisit it. I found that astounding. The state is requiring me and you as a school psychologist to racially profile students, to make a determination on whether a student is black or not black, with no more information than what they look like. That in itself is a racist policy which is mandated by the state of California. If Larry P., as it is now being mandated as a policy by the state of California, the Superintendent of Public Education, and the California Department of Education, of which James is not part of that, right? It is not racist.
I don't speak for.
That's right, he does not speak for them. Is not racist, then I don't know what is. I don't want to be a racial profiler as part of my job. I'm tired of telling a specific population of students that if they want an intelligence test, they have to pay for it. I want to provide the latest and best evaluation processes to all students, regardless of color.
Thank you, Ruben. Good morning, everyone. I also need to do a disclaimer. I am not speaking for the Board of Directors of the American Psychological Association. I think this is the first time I've had to do that. I just joined the board in January. I was not involved in the original Larry P. case. In fact, I began my doctoral education at UC Berkeley in 1988, the year the parents, the challenged African-American parents challenged the 1986 expansion of the Larry P. decision. And I was in graduate school when the decision that the 1986 expansion was rescinded in 1992, but at the same time, the California Department of Education refused to change its regulations. I graduated in 1994 and went to Pennsylvania. And of course, in Pennsylvania, as in the rest of the country outside of California, IQ tests, cognitive tests can be used to help assist in making decisions about students. And we always talk about intellectual disabilities, mental retardation. We don't talk about the fact that there are cognitive tests are also used to identify students with gifted and talented placement and stuff. And so if you can't use the IQ test, you can't do use it for that in that way either. I came back to California in 2003, back to Berkeley, and was confronted with the issue of that California Department of Education ban, which I had not really thought much about because I was not being affected by it. And one of the things I discovered is that many of our school psychology students come to the conclusion that IQ tests are biased on the basis of the ban, despite what we teach them in their classrooms, because they go out into the schools, and in the Bay Area, of course, there are lots of African Americans in the schools, and discover that they can't use these tests, and so that sort of colors their interpretation of the test. Thus, we have to deal all the time with the technical, the issue of bias as a technical term for the program. Every few years, as students cycle through the program, we have to remind our students that legal opinion, while it may require us to do certain things, does not constitute scientific evidence. And I think it's interesting to note that we often forget that shortly after the Larry P. decision was made, a similar court case in the Midwest resulted in a legal opinion that said just the opposite. IQ tests are not biased. Some school districts, so I get back to California and I discovered that some school districts are getting around the ban in very interesting ways. They decided to interpret the ban as a ban on intelligence tests. And so therefore, the differential ability scales does not mention intelligence. So they can use the DAS. They can't use the WISP because it says intelligence. And so many of them, they were using the KBC, they were using the NNAT, they were using a lot of tests that are cognitive tests because they were trying to get their work done, school psychologists, and just not using ones that had the word intelligence in the title. The California Department of Education eventually came to recognize that and then provided a list of tests that you're not allowed to use, including ones that had ability in the title. I'm a psychological scientist, so evidence matters a lot to my thinking. The US has a problem in educating certain segments of its population. That remains the case. Consider a world where there are no IQ tests. I mean, that's the world where African American students exist in California at this point in time. In that world, one would expect, as people have said, things to be very different. However, if we look at the achievement gap, which I will argue is real, the achievement gap is not a result of tests, right? It manifests itself in spelling, in reading, in mathematics, in science. In fact, if you look at scores in civics, which is not offered in many schools, we see this issue. And it has to do with the fact that we are not educating certain segments of our population well. Due to the controversy around IQ tests, they have received more psychometric scrutiny than any other construct that we look at. IQ tests have been studied up and down, the wazoo, by the people who don't want them to be used, by the people who want them to be used, and as such now have turned out to have the most reliable and valid scores of any construct that we measure. The focus on IQ is a red herring because it keeps us from actually addressing the issues we need to address in fixing this education system more broadly so that it serves kids from low-income and ethnic minority backgrounds in a way that does not result in disproportionality in both discipline and in academic performance. And I would argue that until we solve this problem, California continues to be discriminating against African American students to the very good. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. So you've gotten an opportunity to hear from each one of our panelists individually. And now I'd like to move on into the second section of the symposium, and that is, I want to give the panel an opportunity to respond to a question and to interact with one another in terms of their opinions related to the question. Each of these folks here are individuals, they're professionals in their own right, so we don't expect them all to think the same. And so I'm interested, and I'm sure you're interested in as well, how they may debate and defend different questions related to this issue. And then after we close that section, then we'd like to give you, the audience, an opportunity to pose questions to the panel and for them to answer it. So I'll just throw this out to the panel. In essence, as I hear all of you talking, you know, one of the interests that we all have is the future. And we wonder in the back of our minds, is it worth it for us to do what we need to do to pursue an overturning of this decision? Or is it, from your perspective, because you are familiar with the politics and the different players in this drama, is it not worth it? And so I'm wondering if someone can start us off by commenting as to whether or not you think it's worth, not only in California as a professional group, but also in general school psychology, for us to get behind overturning this, or whether or not you may think that that might not be as possible. So anyone can start, and I'll try to corral folks.
All right. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. As you can tell, I'm dealing with voice issues. So I'm going to speak as the CAS president a few years ago. And when I became president-elect in about 2011, there was a court case in one of the school districts called Manteca. And it was a challenge. And I had hoped when becoming president of CAS to be honest with you, this stuff is hard to deal with. And I did not necessarily want to bring it back up, but there were many calls to go ahead and address it. So and one thing we didn't have maybe 35 years ago or even 20 years ago, I recall at least, was that we didn't have a cultural linguistic diversity committee. So maybe. But prior to my joining the board, every time I'd go to the CLD committee meeting, there'd be maybe 5 people. And they were pretty much the same people again and again. So what we tried to do is invite more folks to come. Eventually we started having more conversations, and I think the last one we had in San Diego, we're over 30 people there ready to address this issue. So I think some of the momentum, I'm optimistic about that. So as CAS president, I also look, I want the best and latest in science for students. It's been a long time, and tests have improved, and we have many different types of practices, and I think it's important to move forward. However, I also want us to address overrepresentation. So if you allow me here, I'm going to discuss the ABSI position paper. That's the Association of Black Psychologists. And in their position paper on special education, who's had a chance here to read that position paper? All right. Just us then. So in that position paper, and it's available, it's been updated in 2012 due to some things, and I'll explain in just a moment. But they discuss the causes of disproportionality, but expanded the context to include state and American schooling overall for the past 20 years prior to and after. They acknowledge and partnered with NASP on legislative priorities, and that's fairly new. That happened in 2011. So to me, that's a good sign, because ABSI, one of their first major actions, Association of Black Psychologists, their first major actions was to be pretty much on the other side of the Larry P. court case. So they're interacting with NASP on some policy issues and having discussions. They also, in 2012, met with APA, which they had split from, which was huge. And so some of these seismic shifts have been occurring, so keep me optimistic. They put an emphasis on partnering with parents. They reviewed the context of opportunity and access, as Dr. Worrell was talking about, the achievement gap. And they did not, and this was interesting to me, they did not discount the issue of IQ tests, only acknowledged the need for caution, with test bias, administration considerations, and interpretation informed by the ever-expanding literature. They appreciated the No Child Left Behind accountability, but also, as many of us wondered during that time, where's the money? And then where's the support to move forward with the funding? They looked at a comprehensive approach to systemic, school-wide, and collaborative efforts to make life better for students. They spent some time on familial and personal factors that people should take into account. And they finally discussed teacher training and ongoing professional development.
Let's go ahead and put a pause there and get some of our other folks in. Frank, you
I certainly think it's worth it. I'm not necessarily confident that we're going to win. I think we live in an age where political correctness has become really, really important, and people don't like to touch minority issues. And despite that position paper, I mean, ABSI, I'm a member, I've been a member for over 20 years, has consistently insisted that IQ tests are biased. And I think once there is division in the field of psychology, and in fact, to the extent that this is the group that represents black psychology, that their opinion carries a lot of weight. And so I think courts, but certainly the State Department of Education in California is probably going to be reluctant to overturn unless ABSI takes a position. And up to 2012, there's a special issue of the Journal of Negro Education which talked about bias in tests. Now, tests are biased in some ways and not others. I mean, the disproportionality of the bias that they're talking about is bias that does not exist. But that's the position that many leading black psychologists take.
Ruben?
Yeah, it's important again to take a look yourselves on the actual decision and see what Judge Peckham's decision was. One of the things that he says is, he said his position was not a final decision on the bias of IQ tests. And in fact, he put in place the opportunity for test publishers to go to the State Board of Education, which is a board of education not at local levels, but the state board, to get their particular instrument approved. And that was part of the thing that I was working on with the Department of Education, is to really, and that's why I was presenting to the State Board of Education, because they have the opportunity, they still have that opportunity for for a test publisher, Cecil Reynolds, Jack Naglieri, to go before them, or Cullen Elliott with the DOS, and to get approval based on the data of whether or not their instrument is, the important thing is it's valid for the kind of placements that they're doing. And it could be very narrow, it could be specifically in its use for the identification of intellectual disability. There doesn't have to be an overturning, in other words. The state board can. Let me tell you the financial political thing. The state board, the Department of Education doesn't want to do it, and I heard it directly from their mouths, because they don't have the money to litigate the issue. That's the main thing.
Just to summarize, Ruben brings up a point about the politics, and I know Roger, Ruben, and Betty have all taken their lumps in various ways during the 80s and the 90s in terms of being parts of groups that have argued and try to cajole one another. So I'm wondering, Betty, do you want to say anything about the politics and what you see maybe as an avenue for opening up this issue to others?
Well, I spoke with the California Department of Education special ed director, and his point was, we have our Title V regulations which define certain issues. Those have not been revised in decades, and in the revision that could happen. To change this legislatively would require someone holding the water, carrying it, and pushing it forward. Not likely to happen. I also want to just mention, you know, my concern about all of this is not that it was mentioned how school psychologists do not have continuing education requirements. That's huge in California, and it's been long-standing, and you don't want to, when you're faced with that, you don't want to make one lump grouping decision and replace it with another equally silly one. What we're looking for is something that doesn't make automatic assumptions and really pushes for individual decisions that are used. This doesn't mean everyone should get an IQ test. It means that everyone needs to be able to use professional decision to think about it. And I do want to quote from the Association of Black Psychologists 2012 paper. I think it's important. The education of Africans in America has always revolved around education for servitude. The main purpose of educating black children is preparing them to serve white people, and their primary interest is maintaining white power as the central power of the world. That's dangerous thinking. We need to have alliances that go past that kind of thinking.
Thank you. I know Brandon and Frank are two panel members that in particular have to train successive generations of psychologists to serve children in California. And James has been on the forefront of talking about alternative assessments in the state. So you three folks in particular, and I'll give James an opportunity to talk, given that we can't overturn this law immediately, what are your thoughts as to some promising alternatives for assessing black children? And James, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. First, just to touch on what Dr. Henry was saying, the Title V regs that hadn't been changed since 1988 were recently changed in 2014 July. That's how long it's been sitting there. And we were hoping that something would change, and nothing did. They just added RTI and they added PSW. That was about it to our specific learning disability. In terms of hopes, the Diagnostic Center in Northern California, because of the way the ban is, we wanted to take all the best practices that are out there and utilize that process. So taking CHC theory without the tests. Sounds kind of crazy, but taking CHC theory without the tests, taking some executive functioning neuropsychological things, taking social learning theory, and taking information from our speech language therapists for our language sections. Taking all of that together developing a matrix process, which has been called unwieldy, I believe, by somebody standing here. And time-consuming, I think, was another issue. That process shows promise. It takes time to show trends. You can't say this thing works all of a sudden by boom showing data. But we work with Mount Diablo Unified School District at a time when they had under State Attorney General Camilla Harris, they were under the gun for doing these zero tolerance suspensions, and African Americans and Hispanics were way overly suspended, and they were under an edict to you have to stop that. And they did all of that at the administrative level, and they worked with their teachers. At the same time, we were working with the school psychologists on this alternative method. And we didn't know this at the time. And our thing was more working for SLD identification, but their ED identification had skyrocketed at that time as well, because what do you do when you get people suspended a lot? You try to push them to the special ed door, okay? And maybe they'll help them. And what turned out to happen was, through this process, even though we didn't say you had to follow us, with fidelity, we didn't say you had to do everything we required. We just wanted you to think about it this way for a while, with some supervision for a year, and see what happens. In 3 years, their significant disproportionality for emotional disturbance dropped to below SIGDIF status. Not only did that happen, but for all the other disability categories, they dropped as well. So it wasn't passing the buck to a different program. It took 3 years. Why 3 years? Because the triennials, you have to, are you going to exit them? Do they not qualify anymore? It took 3 years for that data to show up. Okay.
Do we have any comments as to what was said from the panel member? And I think, Frank, were you there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I agree that, in fact, we now have a new range of executive functioning and many neuropsychological tests that allow us to try to get at some aspects of processing, which sort of are not necessarily the same thing as the cognitive processes, the general cognitive processes. But the other thing I think that has been very useful and that, in fact, will help with this is that, at the end of the day, we all thought that the discrepancy model was not a good model, but what the discrepancy models did, at least what a cognitive test did, when you had a student whose cognition was fine and they were not doing well academically, you knew, they often blamed the kid and said, specifically in the disability, it could be a teaching disability, right? RGI has now allowed, when it's done properly, allowed us to address that, and certainly in the elementary grades, because the thing that predicts achievement better than IQ is previous achievement. And so an RTI model then allows us, in fact, to get some information so that, in fact, we can do interventions with a kid. And you can also use tests like the key math and some of the other sort of achievement tests, which, in fact, will give you a sense of how is this kid functioning and how can we intervene.
Thank you. Roger?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's important to know that Larry P. is not a law. It was never codified by the legislature of California as a law. It's a court injunction. So even if we did something legislatively, I'm not sure that would change. But, and I've been told it's never going to change in my lifetime by other people, not anyone here. But again, you just challenged me. So I accept that challenge. It's going to change. Political correctness kills free speech, as far as I'm concerned. If you have a very differing view than someone else, and they don't like it, they're just, you get your back turned to you, and the discussion stops. I'm for free and open discussion of this. And every parent that I talk to that has said, I wanted an IQ test for my child, and the district told me I couldn't have it. I said, what did you do? I just paid $2,500 to have an IQ test given by a psychologist to my child. I said, does that tick you off a little bit? And they said, yes, it does. I said, good. It should tick you off, because I should be able to do that in my school district. If you want an IQ test for your child during an assessment, I should be able to do that for you. And again, as James said, it's not all about the assessment. It's not about the IQ test. It's about doing the best job possible for all of our students, not just everybody except.
Thank you. Ruben,
You know, I think it's important to note, I don't know, I've seen some of Dr. Hiramoto's work, but it's interesting how things have remained the same. In 1980, when I started as a school psychologist, the Diagnostic Center was pushing the ordinal scales. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the ordinal scales, which is a Piagetian perspective, in which is a multiple cognitive abilities perspective, non-standardized, and unfortunately it appears that the Diagnostic Center is still hopeful and promising, hopeful about that promise. And I just think that's the kind of thing that we're doing. We're doing this where we're shifting, and then we have the test publishers who look at California as a big market and they want to do Larry P sensitivity, and they actually provide us something that's hidden, it's disguised, and that's not been productive. And a final thing that's really important, remember, 1.5 African American students are still 1.5 the percentage in special ed throughout the country. Check it out, Google it.
Okay, I apologize for having to rush us through. I wish we could spend a lot more time on this segment, but we really want to move into the concluding segment, and that's the segment where we give you, audience members, an opportunity to address questions that you may have for the panel. And if you have a question, please stand up, say who you want to address your question to. If you need a mic, there's a mic here.
I think I need a mic.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
No.
Okay, I have like a 3-part question. Okay, first question. Looking at Larry P. versus Rouse, which I kind of understand, you know, you guys are saying it's just directed towards African Americans, but which I kind of was taught, and I come from a background that was a special ed teacher, and I also am a school psychologist right now, that it was really directed towards our students of minorities. That's the first question. The second question, because I think it's rather, you were saying that, you know, kids identified as African American in the state of California. Now, my brother is married to a white woman and have biracial kids, and this actually happened in California. They asked her to come to the school and take black off his stats so they could give him an IQ assessment. I was there, you know, visiting with some sharks on, went to the meeting, and then after they finished saying what they had to say, I identified myself as a school psychologist. They stopped the meeting. So,
Wow.
you know, don't want to have that meeting again. So I think it's still happening, especially when you look at students who come from mixed heritage, and that, you know, like what's happening that is being tracked for those students who have black and white both on their, you know, profile. And now the school, in the principal, the administration, is asking them to take off black just so they can be administered a IQ assessment. And one, as an African American, and, you know, mainly I practice in Louisiana, and I've given IQ assessment to gifted, and I've had kids on the WIS side scored 140, black African American males. So that's why. So
I'll respond a little bit to that. What the state said
Roger,
is, even if they look back.
Can I hit the first question real quick?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so you were talking about minorities. So in Long Beach and Los Angeles, 2 things that happened. They said, we're going to treat every kid as if they're black.
Yeah.
So they decided, if it was a banned test, they decided not to use it. So we both practiced it in California for a little bit,
Yeah.
particularly in those 2 areas. And that was kind of the sentiment in Long Beach and Los Angeles.
But the State Department ban, the California Department of Education ban is on African Americans for people who look.
Yeah, yeah.
But that would mean you can't also draw a person, because that's on the banned list, and I don't see how that's an IQ test. But yes, the state came down and told us specifically in Paris Unified High School District, and said it 4 times, and I'm serious now. I was expecting them to say, and as Betty kind of said in her research and talking to me, I expected them to say the 1 drop thing. So they said, even if they look black, so biracial, triracial, doesn't matter. You know, they could be a blonde-headed kid with, you know, curly hair, and the mother walks in and she's black, and they're going, oh, you know, so that puts something in their mind. And to me, that's just, it's racial profiling, and it's wrong, and we shouldn't have to go through that in California. And we're gonna work to get that changed. That's just all there is to it.
Okay, another question? Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, panel. My name is Vita Vasquez, and I'm an undergrad senior at Cal State Long Beach. I'm older because I am transitioning careers. And I attended a workshop yesterday given by Dr. Bob Pasternak, and we were talking about Common Core and how there are many students of all racial backgrounds who are currently opting out of testing, period. And you see them in the streets with billboards saying, I'm not a test score. And one of the points that he made was that there is $11.9 billion being poured into special ed right now. But the focus that we needed to have was more on professional development of teachers because, like you said, sir, we're not educating certain populations well. So do we need to take the focus off of the testing of the kids and their scores and place it more on the teachers and their continuing education? Because like you said, in California, continuing education is not required.
Not for its teachers either.
Could I? So, I think we're in a very, very dangerous era for psychologists and for school psychologists in particular. One of the fundamental definitions of psychology is the study of individual differences. We exist in a world where people are stronger in some things than in others. A test, what a test is supposed to do is it's supposed to give you some information about what you know. So that in fact, that's why we have spelling tests so that the kid knows, you know, and whether we do it through a response intervention model or we do a standardized test, you know, so you need to have algebra to go on to geometry. I mean, Common Core is changing that a bit, but you understand that there are fundamental knowledge that you need at a lower level to move on to a higher level. And that's actually what tests are supposed to do. Because of these differences, and in large part because we are not serving certain parts of the population well, there are differences in tests. But there are differences in test scores that are going to happen even when we are serving everybody well. I have a PhD in psychology. I probably could get one in physics. I suspect I'd still be in school. I'd probably eventually get it if I worked hard enough. It's not my strength. Tests are getting blamed for differences that exist in society. But I would say to each of you, consider the fact if you had to go to get surgery for yourself or a significant other, do you want a surgeon who has passed their boards or one who didn't take them because they didn't think tests told them, the score said anything about them? Do you want to fly a plane with a pilot who doesn't want to take the test because I'm not a test score, I'm a pilot? So I think we need to consider this very seriously because it's raising tremendous problems, I think, for us as a society.
Thank you. Other folks from the audience, sir?
Yes, I have a couple of questions, but I'll make it short. Thanks for providing this information because it helps when I receive these reports from the state of California from African American students who have not been tested. So thanks for sharing the information. It concerns me that, you know, the Public Law 94-142 was just passed in 1975, and then this law or theory was passed in 1978. So what in the world was going on in California for 3 years, you know, for something like this to take place that quickly? But my question is, when the students transition from high school or turn age 18 or 21 and they go to receive vocational training, or most of the vocational rehab centers require some kind of testing. Are they allowed to receive an IQ test then?
Yes,
Okay.
it's that simple.
Yes.
Yes, regional centers, any of those are allowed to give IQ tests.
Yes.
They
So-
just don't go into school records. You have to
Okay.
ask the parents for them.
Okay, gotcha. So when they go for rehab services, they can receive an IQ test?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Dr. Ruben?
Yeah, I want to go back to the question. That was a good question you had about, and some of the comments of Dr. Pasternak. The thing is that the problem with Common Core, and we actually knew it. You're probably not familiar with authentic assessment. We had authentic academic assessment. It's projects oriented, which should sound very much like Common Core because it's the same thing. It was already decided, it was already found in the British Isles that authentic assessment was more biased toward ethnic minorities than regular multiple choice assessments. The critical thing that will make a difference in all groups, including Hispanics, is curriculum. Curriculum is the issue. And once again, how did it happen that Common Core is doing the same thing it did in the 80s with language arts instruction and math? It's because we lose our focus. So even when they're saying it's training, it's curriculum. It is curriculum. And go to the direct instruction people like Doug Carnine and Siegfried Engelman, you'll see that the meat is at the curriculum level.
Okay, just want to say something, we're out of time, but this is not a
We have 2 minutes, Fred.
let me just say this thing real quickly, and then we can stay over certainly. If you look at the green sheet on the back table there, on the second page, there is a web site address there where you can go to that site and you'll find different articles, and some from some of us on the panel, other articles from previous issues of school psychology journals. Just access that to get those articles. And also I just want to give James an opportunity just to say a little bit about how you can access the tape from this session.
So I hope to have this done, that you can view it or share it with your friends. Put it on YouTube, just keyword search NASP, keyword search Larry P, and 2016 talk, and I'll symposia, and I'll have that up maybe in a month or so. I got work to do. So. There's also, if you're interested in that information I've provided about a longitudinal study on alternative assessments, I have some of my handouts from my talk yesterday. One other thing about testing, achievement testing. One of the issues in California is a lot of team decisions because the discrepancy model isn't being made. And part of that issue has to do with No Child Left Behind. California kept its standards fairly high throughout that entire process. And a lot of states dropped their standards so that they would be compliant with the rule by 2014. What happened was when people lowered the standards, all the norming data that contributed to those achievement tests started to drift downward. So the real achievement wasn't what California was expecting. You know, the average for California students was actually getting higher scores on average because we had our standards higher. Now with Common Core, there's going to be a lot more students qualifying if you're still using a discrepancy model because your achievement scores are going to look really bad compared to as soon as the data norming happens because everybody else is supposed to pick up. Now, California, we're still struggling with it because we've kept our standards high, so there's a lot of these team decisions that are happening and we're getting pushback. So there's that issue. So just be aware of where your standards were before Common Core and wait to see what happens when the new tests get normed.
Okay. In your convention booklet, you have all of our email addresses, and also with that web address on the second page of that green sheet, you can access a document that also has all of our email addresses. So please email us, and let's keep this dialogue going. Thank you so much.
That was too short. Well, obviously there's a need for contract services in California. You just give